There's a tendency among certain sections of the ruling elite which makes it seem like they want economic depression. At first this sounds counterintuitive. Why would those who have the biggest stakes in the economy want the economy to decline dramatically? But looking further, we begin to see that there's a bigger picture, a broader aim at restructuring how we do things, and oftentimes certain elites feel as if a correction or a recession does the trick. In 2008, the global financial crisis ended a period of relative prosperity and growth, which turned into the greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression. Policymakers at large responding to the crisis seemed to initially ditch the mainstream economic doctrines in favor of neo-Keynesianism, whereby governments would inject money and credit into the economy to keep businesses afloat and hopefully mitigate the excesses of the recession. And while it worked at keeping major industries alive, it has failed to mitigate the long-term consequences and logics that permeate how we do economics. In economic terms, the government confined itself to a concern about the output gap, or with aggregate demand, as opposed to addressing the labor demand or employment gap, which in turn is based on stimulating effective demand. And so large relative losses were disproportionately concentrated amongst lower income, less educated and minority households, inequality grew, and when employment did grow again, the workforce was increasingly casualized, insecure, and unprotected. It should be noted that for a while, there was already a decline in good jobs such as manufacturing, which had been shipped overseas as economies globalized and allowed corporations to outsource to cheaper developing countries in order to be more competitive. So sure, people had access to better and more advanced consumer goods, the GDP line goes up, but their security, their livelihoods, they're still in jeopardy, they're unstable, they're atomized. And when you situate this in the midst of wealth increasingly being concentrated in a smaller and smaller part of the population in increasingly inaccessible areas, you have two sections of society pitted more and more against each other. Even if you wholeheartedly believe in neoclassical economics, it's a very clear and observable pattern that the inequality produced by these policies is linked to lower social cohesion and increased outgroup derogation, something not primarily directed against disadvantaged social groups, but against those at the top. So then, how is the most popular strain of populism in America simultaneously anti-elite, but also led by the elites? This is where this new section of elites, pundits, demagogues come into play. The missing link comes from an interaction between economic misery and far-right rhetoric that turns citizens against immigrants. This is true for all kinds of scapegoats: immigrants, DEI, woke, trans people, etc. Somehow, Trump has been able to unite working class, mostly white people who were disenfranchised by neoliberalism and globalization, and a particular section of the ruling class who benefited from this economic trend and got crazy rich in the period preceding the global financial crisis. As mentioned before, inequality caused by neoliberalism naturally creates antagonism from lower classes towards upper classes, but the Republicans have been successfully able to funnel that discontent away from, well, themselves towards other perceived outgroups. It's helpful to frame this as a split between the ruling class, a split that's opened an old wound, a split that was caused by the threat or the spectre of mass disillusionment caused by neoliberalism. One side more aligned with the center-to-center left side of politics, like the Democrats, Mark Cuban types, have refused to acknowledge the underlying problems which they've contributed to and benefited from. Emerging now is a fight between those more greeny rainbow elites and a new side of tech giants, some part of the financial world, and fossil fuel executives. It's partially why some of the scapegoats include other billionaires like George Soros, who are seen as representatives of this new economic order which has killed the middle class. Which, by the way, there's a nugget of truth there. These kinds of elites overwhelmingly won out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They got to do the neoliberalism shit, but now the pendulum is swinging back, and we have to reap the consequences. But the answer isn't necessarily to pick one set of detached conglomerates over another. After all, it was the more protectionist social democratic world which informed our current globalized neoliberal one. As I talk about here, the previous economic paradigm was unable to solve the conflicts and contradictions embedded in our society, namely between worker and owner. And so as the rate of profit fell, as working people increasingly organized into collective bodies ready to act, the world came to a crisis point in the early 70s, and economists came up with funny names like wage price spirals and stagflation to explain it. But to get from that point of the more protectionist world to our neoliberal one, a significant set of restructuring was necessary. And with that came what economists and politicians like to call corrections. These market corrections are nice ways of saying severe economic contractions which are induced in order to fulfill some kind of broader ideological restructuring or goal. So in America, you had the 1982 recession, the worst of the post-war period at that point, which was induced by Ronald Reagan's major shifts in fiscal and monetary policy. Here in Australia, you had a particularly stark and overt example where the then Treasurer Paul Keating admitted that in order for neoliberalism to work, the 1990 recession, again Australia's worst post-war recession, was the recession we had to have. And this is because, to quote Paul Keating again, the name of the game was profitability, as this is what this section of the elite and their allies in the political class strive to do. And I mean, I don't have to make a counter-argument. Keating's own government had argued not even a decade prior that deliberately inducing a recession was abhorrent for workers. And of course, these people before the hit would cozy up the language by saying things like, it's just a correction or it's a soft landing.
That if we were going to have a recession, it would be such a relatively small one, because I heard the Treasury and everyone advising me that it would be either no recession or just, well, they said no recession, but if there was to be one, maybe it's the smallest recession. I thought if we're into it and out of it, the change, by and large, is going to be beneficial to Australia.
Anyone who says stuff like this, anyone who says we need a depression or a recession to correct our economy, be wary. They're often trying to lie or cover up for the pain that their policies would cause. So we know from past experiences and paradigm shifts that elites and their friends in the political class are more than willing and able to induce a recession, no matter how devastating, in order to boost the rate of profit and entrench their position further. Recessions are also great tools at demobilizing the union movement, as unemployed workers aren't able to pay their dues and unions lose out on both revenue and manpower to mount campaigns and strikes, which are key obstacles to these kinds of big paradigm shifts. And I mean, given the significant decline in unions since, it's a strategy that's been very effective. So when we see people like Trump and Elon Musk in their respective section of the ruling class that have wrestled state power from the Democrats and their friends talking about the need for temporary pain, alarm bells should be going off in your head. After 2008, neoliberalism has kind of been a zombie for a while now. It's kept on stumbling despite its logics and promises not panning out as originally perceived. In regards to wealth inequality, it's been inadequate. In regards to cost of living, it's been inadequate. In regards to climate change, it's been inadequate. In regards to its own doctrines and outgrowths like trickle-down economics, it has been inadequate. Yet it keeps on trotting along. And this is exactly what the pre-neoliberal world looked like. Through much of the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, social democracy was a zombie that just kept going. Now, however, there are signs of a new fundamental restructuring of the economy, at the very least in the US. Various commentators have attributed names to this. People like Yanis Varoufakis have called this techno-feudalism, but whatever it may look like or shape out to be, I think it's very likely that we're on the cusp of a very big potential paradigm shift. And I think history tells us that when elites start bickering amongst each other, when one side in a relatively violent and vitriolic manner seizes state power and then starts talking about needing small pains or corrections, it's a sign of bigger change. That correction, something I think we're beginning to see in America, is the mechanism to start over, a clean slate for new ways of capital accumulation and state capture.
We're going to complete the mission. We're going to see this battle through to ultimate victory.
Another sign of big paradigm changes is when different classes unite together despite having fundamentally different aims. We saw this here in Australia, where the unions signed what was called the Prices and Incomes Accord, an agreement between the government, the unions, and big business. Despite unions overwhelmingly losing out in the end, real wages falling, and facing the brunt of the 1990 recession, the union movement still committed and has continued to uphold the spirit of the accord. Likewise, Trump's Republicans have united a disenfranchised, mainly white working class, which are against the consequences of neoliberal globalization, rainbow and green capitalism, hence the direct interventions from Trump in regards to tariffs, DEI, and fossil fuels, and an elite that overwhelmingly benefited from neoliberal globalization, whether it be tech giants, big financiers, or the fossil fuel industry. Herein lies a big fundamental contradiction that we've seen already kind of manifest. These elites want to exit from the state. They see themselves as exploited and hindered by the slow, bureaucratic state apparatus. Who cares about liberal democracy when you can vote with your dollar in the economy? Contrarily, a lot of Trump's base wants the government to intervene on their behalf, like with tariffs or with reintroducing and re-centralizing fossil fuel production, making America energy independent. And as I mentioned, we've already kind of seen this contradiction surface, where Trump and Elon Musk faced a bunch of online backlash over their support for H-1B visas. That nativist, interventionist tendency that Trump has attracted by positioning himself against neoliberals outsourcing jobs has at least begun to clash with the interests of those tech elites, and I mean, look who won out. Inverted fascism, post-fascism, neoliberal populism, Trumpism, etc. is a turbulent ideology, not just by virtue of its cult of personality, but also by that cross-class alliance that we talked about. Simply by having more money, more power and influence within the Trump administration, the desires of working people who voted for Trump will go unfulfilled, they'll get crowded out if they contradict the aims and desires of his wealthy benefactors. And that's a contradiction I think we should be able to take advantage of. Building alternative power structures which do center the needs and wants of working people, such as labor and tenant unions, cooperatives, trying to create a force of counterpower using the disenfranchisement and disillusionment generated from both neoliberalism and whatever you want to call Trumpism, is the best way long term. I think center-left people like the Democrats get that wrong. They're very tunnel vision, tailoring everything towards winning the next election. And I mean, it worked for Clinton in the 90s, right? It worked for Obama in the 2010s, but we're now dealing with the consequences of their inability and unwillingness to address those fundamental drivers of what is Trumpism. Likewise, I don't think a more Sanders AOC style left populism is particularly viable or sustainable either, because as we've discussed, the former golden age of American capitalism's contradictions has directly informed its neoliberal descendant. You can still vote Democrat, and I think lesser evil voting has its utility, but we can't center counterpower around electoral politics. We have to build and construct communities that, again, harness that dissatisfaction using mass amounts of people as leverage to force concessions out of existing institutions until we reach a point where we can exist and thrive without those formerly oppressive and restraining institutions.